Following God's call is not about convenience, it's about commitment. When God calls, he is not asking for your opinion, he is inviting your obedience. Too many people want God to bless the plan they already made instead of surrendering to the plan God has already designed. God's call often disrupts your comfort. It may pull you away from what feels safe and familiar because God is more interested in your purpose than your preference. If God only called you to things you could handle on your own, you wouldn't need faith. But when God calls, he always calls you to something bigger than you, so you must rely on him. Following God's call also requires alignment. You cannot walk in God's direction while living in contradiction to his will. Partial obedience is still disobedience. God responds when his people are willing to line up their lives with his truth, even when it costs them something. God's call is not just personal, it's purposeful. When God calls you, it's never just about you. It's about who will be impacted through your obedience. Your yes to God could be the answer to someone else's prayer. Finally, understand this. God does not call the qualified. He qualifies the called. If you wait till you feel ready, you may never move. But if you step out in faith, God will meet you with his power. When you follow God's call, you may not know every step, but you can trust the one who ordered the path. Obedience to God is rarely convenient, and that truth challenges the way many people approach faith. It is easy to say we trust God when his direction aligns with our comfort, preferences, or plans, but when God's call interrupts routines, stretches schedules, or threatens security, obedience becomes a real test of faith. God's call is not designed to fit neatly into our calendars or personal goals. It is meant to shape our lives according to his purpose. Convenience asks, is this easy for me? Obedience asks, is this what God has said? Many people delay responding to God because they are waiting for the right time. They want fewer responsibilities, fewer risks, or clearer outcomes before they say yes. But delayed obedience is still disobedience. When God calls, he speaks with authority, not suggestions. Waiting until obedience feels comfortable often means missing the moment God intended to use. Faith was never meant to be driven by comfort. It is meant to be driven by trust in God's character. Convenience-based faith tends to negotiate with God. It says, I'll obey if the cost is low, or I'll follow as long as I don't have to give that up. Obedience, however, places no conditions on surrender. It recognizes that God sees what we cannot see and knows what we do not know. Choosing obedience means trusting that God's wisdom outweighs our limited understanding, even when the path forward feels uncertain or challenging. Obedience also exposes priorities. When God calls and we hesitate, it often reveals what we value most: comfort, approval, security, or control can quietly take the place of God's authority in our lives. Obedience forces a decision about who is truly in charge. Following God means releasing the illusion of control and accepting that his way may disrupt personal plans. That disruption is not punishment, it is preparation. God's call may require sacrifice, but sacrifice is not loss when God is involved. What feels like giving something up is often God making room for something greater. Obedience shifts the focus from what is being lost to what God is accomplishing. It reminds believers that their lives are part of a bigger story. God's purposes extend beyond individual comfort and reach into eternal impact. Choosing obedience over convenience also strengthens spiritual maturity. Easy faith produces shallow roots, but costly obedience deepens dependence on God. When believers step out without guarantees, they learn firsthand that God is faithful. Obedience builds spiritual endurance, shaping character and trust in ways comfort never could. Growth often happens in moments where obedience feels difficult but necessary. Obedience does not mean the absence of fear. It means choosing faith despite fear. God never promised that following him would be painless, but he did promise his presence. Obedience rests on the confidence that God walks with those who respond to his call. Even when outcomes are unclear, obedience affirms that God is still in control. When obedience becomes the priority, perspective changes. Circumstances no longer dictate faith. Faith dictates response. Obedience shifts focus from temporary ease to eternal significance. It teaches believers to value God's approval over human comfort. In choosing obedience, faith moves from words to action, from belief to surrender, from convenience to commitment. God's call often leads people beyond the limits of their own strength, skill, and confidence. This is intentional. If following God only required abilities we already possess, faith would be unnecessary. God's call regularly places individuals in situations where they must depend on Him rather than themselves. This dependence is not weakness. It is the foundation of genuine faith. God invites people into assignments that expose their limitations so they can experience His sufficiency. Many struggle with God's call because they focus on what they lack. They see insufficient experience, resources, courage, or knowledge and assume they are unqualified. But God's call has never been based on human capability alone. When God calls, He already knows every weakness and still chooses to move forward. Faith begins when people stop asking, "Am I able?" and start asking, "Is God faithful?" The call of God is anchored in who He is, not in who we think we are. Relying on faith beyond personal ability also reshapes how success is defined. Instead of measuring progress by visible results or personal performance, faith measures success by obedience. When believers step out in response to God's call, even imperfectly, they place the outcome in God's hands. This releases the pressure to control results and shifts responsibility from human effort to divine guidance. Faith trusts that God is working even when progress feels slow or uncertain. Fear often surfaces when God's call stretches beyond ability. Fear of failure, fear of embarrassment, and fear of making mistakes can all become obstacles. Yet faith is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to move forward despite it. God's call teaches believers to walk by trust rather than by sight. Stepping into the unknown forces reliance on God's direction, provision, and timing. Each step of faith builds confidence not in oneself, but in God's reliability. God's call also dismantles pride. When success cannot be credited to personal talent alone, glory naturally shifts to God. This keeps faith grounded and humility intact. When believers recognize that progress happens because of God's power at work, gratitude replaces self-promotion. God's strength becomes most visible when human ability reaches its limits. Faith beyond ability ensures that God remains central, not secondary. Walking in faith beyond ability also invites growth. God uses challenges to stretch understanding, deepen prayer, and refine character. When believers rely on God in unfamiliar territory, they learn to listen more closely and trust more fully. Faith develops through experience, not theory. Each step taken in dependence on God's strength and spiritual maturity, it prepares believers for future responsibility. Faith beyond ability also teaches patience. God rarely reveals every detail at once. Instead, He provides enough direction for the next step. This keeps believers reliant on ongoing communication with Him. Trust grows as they learn to wait, move, and adjust according to God's leading. Faith accepts that clarity often comes after obedience, not before it. When believers rely on God rather than their own ability, they also discover God's provision. Needs are met in unexpected ways. Strength appears when energy feels depleted. Wisdom comes when answers seem unclear. These experiences reinforce the truth that God is actively involved in the lives of those who trust Him. Faith beyond ability turns challenges into testimonies of God's faithfulness. Ultimately, God's call invites people into a partnership where divine power meets human obedience. God does not ask for perfection. He asks for trust. When believers step forward despite their limitations, they create space for God to work in ways they could never accomplish alone. Faith beyond ability is not about having confidence in oneself, but about having confidence in the God who calls, equips, and sustains. Following God's call requires alignment between belief and behavior. It is not enough to acknowledge God's direction verbally while living in a way that contradicts His will. Alignment means bringing every area of life into agreement with God's truth, thoughts, choices, habits, and priorities. When alignment is missing, spiritual progress becomes difficult, not because God is unwilling to lead, but because resistance blocks direction. God's guidance flows most clearly where surrender is complete. Misalignment often appears in subtle ways. People may desire God's blessing while ignoring God's standards, or seek His guidance while refusing to release certain behaviors or attitudes. This creates inner conflict. God does not force alignment, He invites it. True alignment begins with honesty, acknowledging where life has drifted from God's instruction and choosing to correct course. Alignment is not about perfection. It is about willingness to be shaped by God's will. Partial obedience is one of the greatest obstacles to alignment. Obeying God in some areas while resisting Him in others creates inconsistency. This divided response weakens spiritual clarity. God's direction becomes confusing, not because He is silent, but because competing voices are being entertained. Alignment requires choosing God's authority over personal preference. It means trusting that God's ways are not restrictive, but protective, designed to lead toward wholeness and purpose. Alignment also involves adjusting priorities. Time, energy, and focus reveal what truly matters. When God's call is central, other commitments must fall into their proper place. This may require saying no to distractions or stepping away from influences that pull life off course. Alignment asks difficult questions about what is shaping decisions. It challenges believers to evaluate whether their lifestyle supports or contradicts their faith. God's call often exposes areas that need change. These moments are not meant to bring shame, but growth. Correction is a sign of care, not rejection. Alignment involves humility, the willingness to admit when adjustments are necessary. God works most effectively with those who remain teachable. When believers respond to correction with openness rather than defensiveness, alignment becomes a pathway to deeper trust and spiritual maturity. Alignment also strengthens integrity. When beliefs and actions match, faith becomes authentic and powerful. Integrity creates consistency, reducing inner tension and increasing confidence in God's direction. It allows believers to move forward without the weight of contradiction. Alignment simplifies faith by unifying purpose and practice, making it easier to recognize and respond to God's leading. Living in alignment with God's will also affects relationships. Choices rooted in God's truth influence how people treat others, handle conflict, and pursue reconciliation. Alignment produces fruit that extends beyond personal benefit. It reflects God's character and draws others toward a deeper understanding of faith. When life aligns with God's call, faith becomes visible, not just verbal. Alignment is an ongoing process, not a one-time decision. As life changes, new adjustments may be required. God continues to refine, redirect, and reshape those who follow Him. Remaining aligned means staying responsive, regularly evaluating whether actions still reflect God's direction. Alignment keeps believers spiritually flexible and attentive to God's voice. When alignment is present, peace increases even in uncertainty. Knowing that life is positioned within God's will brings assurance. Alignment does not remove challenges, but it provides clarity and stability while facing them. It allows believers to move forward with confidence, trusting that they are walking in step with God rather than against Him. God's call is never isolated to one individual. It always reaches beyond the person who receives it. While the call may feel personal, its impact is communal. God works through individuals to touch families, communities, and generations. When someone responds to God's call, the effects ripple outward in ways they may never fully see. This truth shifts the focus from self to service, from personal gain to purposeful influence. It is easy to assume that calling is about fulfillment, success, or personal direction. While God does care about the individual, his call is rooted in something greater. God positions people where their obedience can meet the needs of others. A single decision to follow God can open doors of hope, healing, guidance, or encouragement for those watching or depending on that obedience. What feels like a private step of faith often becomes a public blessing. God's call challenges self-centered thinking. It reminds believers that their gifts, opportunities, and experiences are not random. They are tools meant to be used for the benefit of others. When people ignore or delay God's call, it does not only affect them, it can delay help, growth, or direction for someone else. Obedience becomes an act of responsibility, not just devotion. Understanding that calling is bigger than the individual also brings clarity during difficult seasons. When obedience feels costly, remembering the greater purpose gives strength to continue. Sacrifice becomes meaningful when it is connected to impact. God often asks people to endure discomfort so others can experience growth. The value of the call is not measured by ease, but by effect. God's call also creates legacy. Obedience today can shape outcomes tomorrow. The decisions people make in response to God can influence future generations, setting patterns of faith, courage, and trust. Even small acts of obedience can leave lasting impressions. God multiplies what is surrendered to him, using it far beyond its original scope. Seeing the call as bigger than oneself also cultivates humility. It removes the pressure to seek recognition or control outcomes. When the focus is on God's purpose rather than personal credit, obedience becomes freer and more sincere. Believers learn that they are participants in God's work, not the center of it. This perspective protects against pride and discouragement alike. God's call also fosters connection. When individuals walk in obedience, they often find themselves linked to others who are part of the same purpose. Community forms around shared mission. God weaves lives together to accomplish what no one person could do alone. Recognizing that the call is collective encourages cooperation rather than competition. There are moments when the full impact of obedience is not immediately visible. God does not always reveal who will be helped or how far the influence will reach. This requires trust. Faith believes that God is using obedience even when results are unseen. Many outcomes unfold quietly, gradually, or long after the initial act of faith. Trusting that God is working beyond what can be observed keeps believers faithful in the process. When people embrace that God's call is bigger than themselves, motivation shifts. Obedience is no longer driven by personal reward, but by purpose. This perspective strengthens perseverance and deepens commitment. Knowing that others are connected to one's obedience gives weight to every decision. It transforms ordinary faithfulness into meaningful contribution. Ultimately, God's call invites individuals into something far greater than personal ambition. It offers the opportunity to be part of God's work in the world. When believers respond, they step into a role that extends beyond their own lives, touching hearts, shaping futures, and reflecting God's purpose through willing obedience. God does not call people simply because they are qualified by human standards. He calls them because he has a purpose that only they, in partnership with his power, can fulfill. Often, individuals hesitate to respond to God's call because they feel unprepared, unskilled, or inadequate. This feeling is natural, but it misses the core truth. God equips the called. Qualification is not a prerequisite for obedience. It is a product of it. When God calls, he provides what is necessary to accomplish the mission. Whether it is wisdom, strength, resources, or courage, many people think they must first be ready before saying yes to God, but this is the opposite of how God works. Readiness comes through action, not waiting. When someone steps out in faith, Even with uncertainty, God begins to fill in the gaps. He develops the skills, deepens the character, and provides the guidance needed to meet the challenges ahead. In other words, God's call is both an invitation and a training ground. The journey itself shapes the individual into the person capable of fulfilling that call. God equips the called in different ways. Sometimes he provides instruction through scripture, mentors, or circumstances that teach resilience and discernment. Other times he provides resources or opens doors that would have been impossible through human effort alone. In every situation, his equipping aligns with the purpose he has set. This divine preparation emphasizes that success in God's call is not reliant on human ability, but on God's faithfulness and provision. Fear of inadequacy is one of the greatest obstacles to responding to God's call. People often compare themselves to others or look at what they lack rather than what God can do through them. Feeling unqualified can paralyze action. But faith requires stepping forward despite doubt. God's power is made perfect in weakness, meaning that when human ability falls short, his strength becomes evident. The limitations that seem to disqualify someone are actually opportunities for God to demonstrate his sovereignty. The process of being equipped also shapes spiritual maturity. As believers respond to challenges that exceed their natural capacity, they develop trust, patience, and perseverance. These qualities cannot be cultivated without stepping into situations that demand reliance on God. Each act of obedience becomes a lesson in dependence and a reminder that human limitations do not define potential. God's equipping is holistic, encompassing both practical skills and spiritual growth. Being qualified by God is different from human recognition of readiness. Society often emphasizes experience, education, or reputation as markers of qualification. God's standard is different. He looks at willingness, faith, and obedience. Those who are willing to follow him, even in uncertainty, are the ones he can use most effectively. Willingness opens the door for divine empowerment in a way that self-reliance never can. God's equipping also includes sustaining grace. The challenges of following his call can be intense and the task may seem overwhelming. Yet God promises his presence, wisdom, and strength throughout the journey. Believers may encounter obstacles, opposition, or moments of doubt, but his equipping ensures that they are not alone. Divine support allows them to continue even when human resources or energy are insufficient. Faith plays a central role in receiving God's equipping. Stepping out in obedience requires trusting that God will provide exactly what is needed, even when it is not yet visible. This trust is both an act of humility and a recognition of God's sovereignty. The moment someone moves forward in faith, God begins to work in ways that exceed their expectations and abilities. Qualification is no longer measured by self-assessment, but by God's provision and empowerment. Ultimately, the principle that God qualifies the called reminds believers that their potential is not limited to what they can do on their own. Every skill, opportunity, and ability needed to fulfill God's purpose is supplied through him. Waiting to feel ready often leads to inaction, but stepping out in faith invites God's power to fill the gaps. God's call is an invitation to trust, to grow, and to witness the extraordinary work he accomplishes through ordinary people who are willing to obey. Faith requires action, and responding to God's call means moving forward even when the path is unclear. Often, people hesitate because they want to know every detail before taking a step, believing that readiness must come before obedience. However, God's call is designed to be followed in faith, not in full understanding. The journey of obedience itself produces clarity, equips the believer, and deepens trust. Waiting for certainty can become a barrier to fulfilling the purpose God has placed before them. When people step out in faith, they demonstrate trust in God's character rather than relying solely on their own understanding or resources. God does not expect perfection or complete preparation. He expects willingness Every act of obedience, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, positions the believer to experience God's provision, guidance, and transformation. Faith is active, and action in faith opens the door for God to work in ways that would be impossible through hesitation. Uncertainty is a natural part of following God's call. Live. E is unpredictable, circumstances change, and outcomes are often hidden. Yet faith does not require full visibility of what lies ahead. Choosing to obey in spite of uncertainty strengthens dependence on God and shifts focus from fear to trust. When believers step into the unknown, they learn firsthand that God's promises are reliable and his guidance is sufficient. The experience of moving forward without knowing every step creates resilience and spiritual maturity. Stepping out in faith also develops discernment. As individuals follow God without complete clarity, they learn to recognize his voice, respond to his timing, and interpret his direction in real time. This kind of experiential learning cannot happen without action. Hesitation delays growth, while obedience cultivates wisdom. Each step of faith teaches the believer how to navigate challenges, make decisions, and rely on God's counsel in practical ways. Faith in action often requires courage. Moving forward without a complete map can be intimidating. Fear of failure, criticism, or the unknown can be paralyzing. Yet courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to act despite fear. Obedience requires believers to prioritize God's call over personal comfort and security. Each step taken strengthens confidence, not in personal ability, but in God's faithfulness and sustaining power. God honors those who act in faith. When believers step out without knowing every detail, God meets them with his provision. Resources appear, guidance becomes clear, and doors open that were previously unseen. This demonstrates that obedience activates God's involvement. Faith is not passive. It creates a dynamic interaction where divine power and human willingness intersect. The act of moving forward invites God to work in ways that exceed human capacity. Stepping out without complete clarity also reinforces humility. B. Believers recognize their dependence on God, acknowledging that success is not solely the result of their effort or understanding. This awareness shifts the focus from self-reliance to God-reliance, fostering a deeper relationship with him. Obedience teaches that human understanding is limited, but God's wisdom is limitless. And trusting him requires stepping into what cannot be fully controlled. Action in faith influences others as well. When someone moves forward in obedience, they become an example of trust and courage. Their willingness to act despite uncertainty can inspire and encourage those around them. God's work through an obedient life often has ripple effects, impacting families, communities, and even future generations. The courage to move without full clarity demonstrates that God's purposes extend beyond individual understanding. Ultimately, faith requires stepping forward before everything is clear. God calls, equips, and sustains those who act in obedience. Waiting for perfect understanding often delays the fulfillment of God's purposes, but taking action in trust opens the door for his power to be displayed. Each step of obedience, even in uncertainty, builds reliance on God, deepens spiritual maturity, and positions the believer to witness his faithfulness in extraordinary ways. Acting in faith is the bridge between God's call and the fulfillment of his purpose. Responding to God's call often requires patience because God's timing rarely matches human expectations. People want immediate answers, clear directions, or visible results, but God's plans operate on his perfect timing, not ours. Patience is not passive waiting, it is active trust. It involves continuing to obey, serve, and prepare while trusting that God's timing is precise, even when outcomes remain unseen. Those who embrace patience.
Loving you alone feels so beautiful. And yet, it hurts. hurts the most. You became my quiet sunrise, the dream I never dared to say. Every smile you gave so freely took my breath a little away. I held this love like fragile glass, so precious, soft and true. But every beat inside my heart was only reaching out to you. Unspoken love is sweet and painful, like honey mixed with rain. A tender hope I hold so tightly, while it slowly breaks me. Loving you from just one side now leaves my soul in silent blue. 'Cause the deeper that I fall alone, the lonelier I do. I can't blame my heart for choosing someone it could never keep. So I smile through hidden heartache and love you quietly. Unspoken love is sweet and painful, like honey mixed with rain. A tender hope I hold so tightly, while it slowly breaks me. Loving you from just one side now leaves my soul in silent blue. 'Cause the deeper that I fall alone, the lonelier I do. Maybe loving you in silence is the closest I can stay, though it leaves behind a sorrow that may never fade away. Unspoken love is sweet and painful, like honey mixed with rain. A tender hope I hold so tightly, while it slowly breaks me. Loving you from just one side now leaves my soul in silent blue. 'Cause the deeper that I fall alone, the lonelier I do.